You're listening to The Solution, a podcast by Growers Mineral. I'm your producer, Russell Bobel. In today's episode, they discuss the topic of algae blooms. What are they, and why do we care? This is the second part of a 3-part series. If you missed part 1, you can go back and listen to that. Let us know if you have any topics that you would like us to cover in future episodes. Now, over to Marguerite and the research team.
So this is part 2 with Zach and Jim discussing algae blooms. And if you didn't catch that, you can look at our beginning part of this, which talks about eutrophication and gives a background necessary to understanding the next 2 sections. So this is section number 2. So Zach, why don't you start us off? I think you wanted to provide a little bit of a history lesson for us here, which I'm very excited to hear about algae and algal blooms because they didn't used to be as abundant. Is that correct?
Yeah. And Jim, you can probably add to this discussion quite a bit because I'm going to be talking about the pre-Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement times. So algae blooms are nothing new. I should first point out that algae blooms occur naturally in many water systems throughout the world. They are not a purely or solely man-made phenomena. Right. And so I don't want to completely vilify them. They serve a purpose just like anything. But when they occur because of unnatural or artificial nutrient addition to the system, then that's when they can cause problems. So back in the, mid 20th century, there weren't really any regulations governing nutrient pollution from any source. So we're talking wastewater systems, factories, farming, whatever the case may be. And so companies and individuals and groups were free to essentially dump whatever waste they wanted to. And that came with a host of other problems, like rivers lighting on fire because there's so much flammable detritus floating on top of it. But one of the things that it started to lead to throughout the 50s and 60s was these really, really, really severe algae blooms in Lake Erie. And so I also preface this by saying I understand that Lake Erie is not the center of the world for everybody. There are many people in our organization who are not in Lake Erie watershed who have really nothing to do with the lake. We understand that. I understand there are Chesapeake Bay, Gulf of Mexico. There are smaller lakes and systems that suffer from this as well. But given where we all live and my history and education, Lake Erie makes a very, very good case study. So that's why I'm focusing mostly on that. The lessons and the mechanics of how this stuff works, it works the same anywhere. So you can take these lessons back home if you'd like.
Yeah, that history, Zach, you've got that pegged pretty decent. I graduated from high school in 1969, and when I was like in junior high or younger, the lake was very clean. I mean, you looked at it as something very clear. And by the time I got into high school, dead fish on the beach was something that was quite common. And like you were saying, with the Industrial Revolution that came out of the 1920s, basically the Roaring 20s, as they called it, this manufacturing thing got going, and people they were dumping material anywhere to get it off site. And see, that's all going to drain into a natural drainage way, which ended up particularly in the lake. But you're absolutely right. All these other water systems are influenced the same way. So at that point, people were complaining, about the cesspool effect on Lake Erie. And like you said, I was in high school when they lit the Cuyahoga on fire. I think that was in the late 60s also because of the paint thinner that was being dumped by DuPont into the water system. And so right away, as you'll get into the discussion of point source and non-point source, point source was very easy to find. And so the industries were struggling with that right out of the chute because the Environmental Protection Agency came into existence under President Nixon, which is the early 70s. And see, they were studying these issues with this loss of waste, whether it was nutrient or even organic waste. And so your timeline on that is correct. And then it kind of jumped around a little bit after they started. It was very easy to get rid of point source. So now they're starting to look at non-point source because they realize that too was contributing quite significantly.
So just to back up just for a minute, you're using some terms that I'm not really familiar with. And in case someone else isn't, can we just define what's point source and what's non-point source pollution?
Yeah, very point source that you could actually go to where the waste is coming into the water system. It's a one place event or one place,
like an oil leak right there.
That's
okay,
right. Or a refuge that comes out of a plant, and then they can measure that directly and then tell this company, well, you've got too much that's being lost there. Now, non-point source is much broader. There's not a particular point that you can go to, and that's where agriculture comes in, because you've got all these acres that are draining. They're eventually coming to a point source, but there's a lot of contribution from a very large area, and you can't pinpoint it like you can with point source, which that's mostly agricultural per se. Now you get into lawn care, golf courses, they contribute too, but their total contribution is smaller than all
agriculture combined. Right. Yes, exactly. Yes. So it's just the runoff from all those different things,
right.
and you couldn't
several
pinpoint.
Ways it can drain through the land, or it can run off the surface of the land, because the farmer has to get that away so that his system works correctly for him. But as it gets away, it's dragging things with it, depending on what has been applied to that particular system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Jim. So with the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement in the early 70s, it brought in regulations on point source pollution. So they were able to clean up and control that. Phosphates were banned from detergents, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And that did very well in preventing further algae blooms. Like I should emphasize here that at that point, the lake was so bad, like the algae blooms were so bad, and we'll get into how that works, that they were considering declaring the lake dead, because so much aquatic life had been lost from the dead zones, the lack of oxygen. And so there was really an urgency, a push to get this fixed, because like Jim said, there's so much that relies on Lake Erie. It's such a central ecosystem to humans and to nature that, there had to be some semblance of predictability to it.
Absolutely.
And so over the next, from the early 70s until the mid 90s, that worked. Algae blooms weren't a major concern. The populations of fish and other species came back, and the industries that relied on the lake were able to recover some. But then in the mid 1990s, the blooms started to come back. And since about 2010, they've come every year. It's not really a question of if it will come, it's how bad will it be? And so that's primarily because of non-point source pollution. We could get into a variety of topics here that I don't think we will for this, as to specifically what kind of non-point source pollution that is, but suffice it to say, as Jim said, a lot of it is coming from agriculture. And then there's been an explosion since the 90s in chemical use and in certain fertilizer usages. So I think we can tentatively but relatively safely attribute it to that.
So why did that? Do we know why that happened in the mid 90s? Was there an increase in agriculture or something, or methods changed?
Pardon me, the methodology of agriculture had changed significantly in the 90s, the 80s and 90s versus, let's say, the 50s, for example, with rotational agriculture changed significantly, and the usage of fertilizer to stimulate plant growth increased quite significantly, and the way it was applied was changed, and all these factors led to the loss of the material. And see, that's still in big debate today, is how do we stop that? And from our standpoint at growers, it's a volume thing. They don't need the volume to get the results that they're looking for, in our opinion. And then if we increase efficiency at that point, we can help solve some of the problem there also.
Right. I'm going to read something that Zach gave me, kind of talking about algae blooms and talking about what you just said. He said a plant is 96% carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The remaining 4% of plant tissue is largely supplied by elements naturally present in the soil. There's very little additional fertility actually needed, but where it is needed, it must be supplied more efficiently. I think that's very clearly said what we're talking about here.
Trying to do. That's the mindset of the growers program.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great, Zach.
Yeah. I'd like to kind of walk through what an algae bloom actually, like how it happens and the causes of it, and then what it does. So I think that'll give guys a better understanding of what they see each year in Lake Erie. Again, that'll be our context. But again, these lessons apply in any water system, fresh or salt. Mm-hmm. So every spring, usually spring brings more rain. More rain means more runoff. More runoff means more nutrient loss, especially when guys are applying heavy loads of fertilizer in the spring. So that gets washed into the lake eventually, or into other systems. And Lake Erie is the way that it's like physiologically structured. The western third of it, the western basin, it's called, is the shallowest. Jim might be able to say the average depth. It's quite shallow. And then as you move east, the lake gets steadily deeper. And so given that eutrophication, one of the variables in it is heat and sunlight. Shallower water, which warms up faster and doesn't block as much sunlight getting to the depths, is more susceptible to it. And then in addition to that, you have the St. Clair River and the Maumee River and the Sandusky River all coming into that basin as well, all of which come from both industrialized and heavy agriculture lands. So you get all that stuff washed into those rivers and brought into the lake in the spring. And then the summer heat and sun arrives and you have perfect conditions for algae growth. And that's true. That was true 500 years ago in the lake. That's when the algae would grow. It just wouldn't be as severe. So in the Western Basin, if you ever look at a map of Lake Erie in the summer, if you're looking at the algae blooms, you'll notice that it's all in the west. But because the lake flows from very slowly, but it flows west to east from St. Clair River, that area, over to the Niagara River, and then down into Lake Ontario, the algae will steadily move east. So it gets all big and green and there's those big mats. Well, that's all living algae. And it floats on top of the water and it slowly floats east. And then as it goes, it has a naturally short lifespan and it dies. Well, when it dies, it becomes saturated and it starts to sink. And that's usually in the central basin of the lake. And that's where you get the big fish kills, because it'll sink. And then as it's sinking, it'll start to decompose, and decomposition requires oxygen. And when you're underwater, the only source of that oxygen is from the water, H2O. And so slowly what ends up happening is you get all the dissolved oxygen in the water being used up by this decomposition process, because there's so much algae, there's so much decomposition going. It actually creates an anaerobic zone in the water. And that's when you get these organism kills, because anything that can't get out of that zone actually suffocates. It's hard for us to think of something suffocating underwater. Like a fish, it's supposed to be able to breathe that stuff suffocating underwater, but that's what happens. And that's what was happening in the 60s and 70s with the dead zones, with the fish washing up on shore. They actually suffocated to death. And then you get even worse when you get to the bottom of the lake, because you have a lot of stuff down there that's not very mobile. A fish can swim out potentially. Crayfish, clams, mussels, they can't move very fast. So they're stuck. If they get stuck in a dead zone, they're screwed. And then, the eastern basin of the lake is not usually too bad, because by the time everything gets there, it's being decomposed and it's much deeper. So it's colder and less sunlight, and it's not a huge deal. So you get the algae bloom in the west, you get the dead zones in the central. So kind of that's the process. And that happens anywhere. The dead zones are the real danger. And then also as a relatively minor, when the algae is alive, it can produce a toxin called,
Mycocystin.
Help me out here.
Mycocystin.
That's right. Thanks. That's a neurotoxin. So it's actually like there's animals that have died, dogs that have gone swimming in algae blooms that have died because it gets into their system, and it can harm humans in large enough amounts. And that's what shut down water intake systems in Pelee Island in Toledo, is algae plugged them up. And then the concern is that mycocystin is going to get into the water supply. So that's kind of the mechanics of how an algae bloom works and the damage that it does.
That was a great lesson. I didn't know a lot of that. That was great. It's very alarming. I feel very concerned. I grew up right on the lake, so I know, algae blooms are happening right now. You don't go in the water, but it was never expressly explained that was the reason why. So that's fascinating and concerning.
Yes.
Yeah. What a great case study, though. So you did say same principle applies to other bodies of water with algae blooms as well, right? So you have same idea of you have the algae bloom and you have dead zones and the algae bloom moves, right? Same idea.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's great.
The only difference in a saltwater system is that phosphorus is not usually the limiting nutrient. It'll be nitrogen or something else, but I mean, same principles still apply. You introduce that limiting factor in and you have the explosion of growth.
Yeah, no, you're correct there, Zach. The saltwater in the Gulf of Mexico, where the dead zone has been a big problem, the introduction of the excess nitrogen, which we're getting into Lake Erie also, but the explosion of the bloom comes more from phosphorus because of the limiting factor of it. And that dead zone idea in the middle of the lake, that's very interesting because everybody is focused on the bloom itself because of the mycocysteine being toxic to humans. But again, we're injuring the system with the dead zone that we create as the algae migrates to the east and starts to degrade, because that degradation in the Gulf. See, the shrimpers are very big in the Gulf of Mexico, and their ability to have good harvests have been injured quite significantly by that, because the shrimp just can't go anywhere. And like you said, in the dead zone, they just can't breathe because the dissolved oxygen in the water is a problem with that degradation process.
Yeah. And that happens naturally. The dead zones do occur naturally, but not to the size and scale that we're seeing because of this. Not even close to it.
See, they claim in China that some of those dead zones are humongous and are very, very strong because of the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that the Chinese government is subsidizing the farmers with to try to get their yields up. Because the establishment has told the politicians that that's how you get more bushels, is by putting on more nutrients. And they're just losing more and making the area that much more toxic.
So what have we done to try and mitigate that and decrease the dead zones?
Try to get the farmer to believe that he has to follow a different protocol of fertilization. And see, it's kind of the same as we've got with the COVID. How much can we force people to follow a particular practice through education, because they believe that they have to do it some way to sustain their living. And see, this is where the problem is going to come in, is whether the judicial branch is going to get involved with this and basically
actually pass a law to
stop
limit
the application. That's
right. And so is there no option to increase, so if you have too much phosphorus, to increase the other, the nitrogen and the oxygen? Right. Have we tried any options like that of, we have too much phosphorus, but let's increase the other things?
Yeah.
Is it impossible?
The situation is trying to restrict all of it. Basically, the nitrogen and the phosphorus are the two main culprits that lead to the growth of the algae. We have to do something to control that loss. And there are practices that they try to implement to cut that back. But the biggest problem is the volume. You're just putting on way more than you actually need because, as you said before, 96% of the crop is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, sunlight, air, and water. And see, they're using the other elements to stimulate that growth. And in reality, you don't need it to get the final yield that you're looking for. You just have to apply it more correctly to maintain the yield, and using less is going to have less be lost into the environment. That's right. Exactly.
So the methodology for farmers changed, and you said that it became more focused on fertilizer and adding more fertilizer. But what was the methodology before? What were they doing before?
Rotation. Every farm had livestock, and you recycled through the livestock those nutrients. You fed what you grew, and the animal used a certain portion of it and excreted the rest, and then you put that excrement back out there again, and that kept your fertility levels, or your ability to grow the crop, at a very productive level. But
you had to rotate.
That's right.
So you couldn't use all the land.
That's right. And see, again, as we've isolated the raising of animals into concentrated lots, most farmers now don't have animals, so they are only growing the crops, and they feel they need stimulation, which they're getting through the fertilizer. And we don't disagree that the fertility from the manure was very, very helpful. Plus, the biological part of it, the manure was very effective in stimulating the biological. And as they've gotten away from that, the chemical use of fertilizer has reduced that efficiency. And the grower's program, is to try to re-stimulate that. Now, can you be as efficient without the manure with the grower's program? Probably not, but you can be much more competitive with the volumes that you use when you follow the grower's program than if you just try to stimulate your production all through fertilization.
So it is possible to do it without the manure as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Maybe, but better with it.
Yeah,
okay.
You're better with it, but we've got guys that have done it forever without it, but they don't use near the volume that other people are using, that totally ignore the biological that's in the soil, that comes with the educational process. In other words, the fertilizer companies and the universities have followed the fertilizer companies and telling the farmer that if you don't put the fertilizer on, you're going to hurt your yield significantly.
And it's not that that's untrue. It's just that they're doing it inefficiently.
And there's side effects. And the side effects are these losses into the environment, which now is starting to affect a larger number of people. And see, that's what it's going to break down to. Who's swinging the biggest bat? See, and right now, as the number of farmers decreases and the number of people that want to go swimming in the lake is pretty stagnant or pretty level and going to increase, now the farmer's got to own up to that and see what he can do to change that. Or judicially, they will do something about it because it'll be demanded by the population. And see, the universities are throwing up their hands and say, well, you can't do it with less. And at Growers Mineral Corp, we say, yes, you can.
Yeah. So it's not that we are doing it the wrong way. It's not that using more fertilizer is wrong. Right. It's just using it in such excess is not efficient and is causing runoff and all these other consequences. And we don't want that. So we really need a solution. But the old way of rotating wasn't the solution. So it is an improvement. But now we need the next step in the revolution, which we really see is the growers program.
That's right. The number of guys going back to small farm, everybody with livestock, is probably not going to happen. So is there an intermediate in there? We say yes.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please subscribe and share with a friend. If you'd like to learn more about the Growers Program, visit our website, www.growersmineral.com.